All right. We are live on most platforms, about to go live on Instagram any moment now. And let's get rolling. Today, we have a really fun group of folks to talk to us about this new book. I'm surprised I'm not fanning out about it already, by the way. But Psychedelic Outlaws, the stories that you tell in that book are unbelievable. We're going to get into a bunch of it. We're joined by one of the let's say, most influential psychedelic outlaws, Bob Wold, founder of Cluster Busters, Jim Fadiman, who's been around in the psychedelic space since the early days at Stanford, early LSD days. Really excited to have you. And Joanna Kempner, professor of sociology at Rutgers. Is that right?
That's right. Thanks.
Yeah, really excited for this one. So I guess for me, I've always come up in this as a sort of outlaw topic. I didn't really consider, unless you're, have the patience and time to get credentials, you can't really approach it otherwise. But I loved your framing. But let's maybe chat. Like, how did this topic come on your radar? Was it medical anthropology, sociology? What was it for you?
Yeah. Well, so I am a sociologist by training and discipline, but I I think I'm probably people are probably more familiar with a little bit if they're familiar with anything with anthropology and history. And I am kind of a more interdisciplinary anyway. I like stories. That's how I and I like to follow ideas. That's usually what my research looks like is I like to follow ideas. And I've been doing research. Oop, I think I have. I touched my mic. I'm sorry. I've been doing research on pain for a long time. So I didn't come to this work because of an interest in psychedelics. Although, I mean, I've always thought psychedelics were pretty great, just in like a kind of generic way. Um, and I came to my sociology with this just because because I was interested in justice. And as a sociologist, I was also really interested in problems that don't get talked about a lot. Usually, sociologists work on big problems like poverty and inequality and racism, and um, and I somehow had was really drawn to things like big gaps, things that we should be thinking about and talking about, but we don't talk about. And I think that was probably because I am a chronically ill person. I have chronic migraine, and nobody ever spoke about it. And so I ended up getting into pain. I have this feeling that people who are really sick are really smart about the gaps in the healthcare system. And so if I follow them, they will tell me what medicine isn't doing well. And that's really how I stumbled into Cluster Buster's story. I had heard about them. I think I first heard about them there was an article published in 2006 in Neurology where which was this case study. I didn't know that Cluster Busters had been responsible for that study yet, but there was a case study about psychedelics helping, and that kind of perked my interest. Um, yeah, the other thing that I've always been really interested in and really passionate about is the political suppression of science. And um, during the George W. Bush administration, I was getting really angry about that in particular. So when I wasn't studying pain, I was really studying this kind of suppression of science, the kind of post-truth world in the making. And I saw when I met Cluster Busters, I saw this really interesting phenomenon. I saw a group of patients who were providing a model of resistance to political suppression of science and who were also filling a gap in medicine. And I think that was just catnip for me.
Mm. Catnip. Bob?
Yeah. Um, well, it was very nice meeting Joanna in Washington, D.C. when we were there on a Headache on the Hill event. And yeah, she got to know our community and learned a lot about us. And we're still doing it. So, yeah, I just got back from a our conference in Glasgow, Scotland, and there were people there from 9 or 10 European countries, and it's very interesting to see the problems that everybody has, and they're all different depending on which country they're from. So yeah, it's a big issue that touches on a lot of things that we're trying to find help for people in our community with.
Yeah. So, who's best to describe what a cluster headache is, just so we kind of have a little bit of context there?
I think you have to ask the person who's actually had them.
That makes a lot of sense. Bob, could
Yeah.
you? Thank you.
So, yeah, it's funny when this question comes up because I can certainly describe them the best that I can, but the problem with cluster headaches is that there are a lot of adjectives that don't fit cluster headaches when you talk about how much something hurts or other issues. There really haven't been words to describe them. Cluster headaches usually start for people in their mid-20s when they're first starting out to build their life. They're hit on the one side of the head with an extremely sharp embedded pain, usually behind the eye. It'll knock you off your feet. You'll be on your hands and knees for an hour or an hour and a half, and then it'll go away completely. While the first one's happening, you probably think that you've got a brain tumor and it goes away, and then you're relieved that you probably don't have a brain tumor, but then 2 hours later, you're hit again with this extreme pain that lasts the same amount of time the first one lasted, and within 2 minutes of it starting to relieve itself, it's completely gone, and you can, if you can get up off the floor, go back to your life again. Normally, for about 85% of the people, they go through cycles once or twice a year that last 6 weeks to 3 months, and then they go away again until the next time that they're scheduled to come, usually during a fall or spring cycle or the high points. But we really don't know why it's tied to those seasonal changes. And there is no cure, and people live with them, till they're 70, 80, 90 years old. The oldest one that I had ever talked about and tried to help with her cluster headaches was 99 years old and living in a nursing home in Denmark. And her 77-year-old daughter called me on the phone to try to get help for her. And I thought she was talking about for herself. And then I was surprised to find out it was for her 99-year-old mother. Some people grow out of them, but most don't. So.
Thanks for sharing that. I've only really encountered one person other than the group at Cluster Busters who was a sufferer, and I thankfully was able to help them source mushrooms in their deep time of need. And it's for those that just don't, it's unfathomable for those of us without this kind of chronic pain condition, the level and depth of pain. Jim, I'm kind of curious, when did this topic or other kind of outlaw psychedelic research come onto your radar?
Well, I guess all of my research since research became outlaw. But Cluster Busters, I was invited to come to the conference, and Joanna can help me. And was it 2013 or 14?
2015, which was one that I missed. I had just had a baby. For that, I remember that date.
And what I realized when I was invited to the conference, and I understood it a little better, is as far as I could tell, and I met with Bob probably over the phone a few times, and as we all have, liked him and was interested and quite ignorant. And then I realized that it seemed like each conference had one person who was as scientific as they could get to be there, so that the people I met, who still in my mind are the most courageous people I have ever met, would be reminded that there were people with a scientific background who not only understood to some extent what they were going through, but totally supported their off the grid, learning how to take care of themselves, learning how to help others, becoming a community, supporting one another. It was an incredibly moving experience. I met people who had stories which are as terrible as the ones described in the book, and there were many, and they were cheerful to be there. They were delighted to be with each other. And sometimes someone would say, well, John can't join us for a while. He's having a cluster. And they were able to not only be cheerful, but to function and to understand that in helping each other, they were making a difference that they couldn't get any other way. And the fact that the medical community remained ignorant was hard to explain.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And the topic has been on my radar. Bob, I don't know if we've even talked about this in all of our conversations, but Cluster Busters was very early on my radar as part of my path, and was some of your research published, I think, in some of the early MAPS journals, was some of the first research I even read as an undergrad. So I was really impressed by that. So
Okay.
at the same time, recognizing how inadequate the level of science, the amount of science happening was, which is a real problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Joanna, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this term psychedelic outlaw, which I think is amazing. And I just love how you put it in the book. And then also perhaps a little about how the psychedelic mainstream research culture is benefiting and perhaps has been collaborating with the underground for a long time.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking me that. One of the things I do, I focus a lot on rhetoric and on words in my research, and there's a part of me that cringes every time I see every single word in my title, every word that I use. Ordinary people, like what is a not ordinary person, right? Like every part of it is, I want to kind of unpack it. So let me just back up just a moment, just to kind of really emphasize that cluster headache is widely considered the worst pain that a person can experience. I mean, there are other very painful things that people can experience. I didn't really understand that. As a person who lives in pain, I didn't really understand that until I was kind of embedded in this community. And then in contrast, there's very, very little medical attention to this. So this is a group that's really patching together their own care. I think that term outlaw evokes, a kind of Timothy Leary sort of sensibility, not this ordinary person. But our healthcare system is constantly forcing people to break the law. Even though the case of cluster headache is so extreme, it's also entirely relatable. It's like so many of us have had to borrow medicine from somebody, or, we just like constantly hacking our care. We're frustrated that we can't get through to our doctor, and then we turn to Google and figure out what's happening. And there's something so you can just see it, so, but what I think is interesting about this term outlaw is it hits on a kind of complex, contradictory nature of how we think about some substances as drugs, some as medicines, some as poison. There's a little, we kind of like outlaws, like we kind of romanticize outlaws. And some of the people who lead the psychedelic movement get to talk about their illicit drug use very openly and very publicly. And we think of them as heroes. But there are lots of people who are using all kinds of illicit substances who we think of as criminals. And so I kind of start the book by trying to pull apart this idea of the outlaw, and thinking and trying to kind of pull apart some of those questions. One of the things I really liked about this story, I like a lot of stories, but I don't write books about all of them, is Clusterbuster's journey starts to, it's just, you have to ask some questions about who's the real outlaw here. who's the real criminal in this story, who's the real expert in the story. I mean, sometimes as patients, we feel like we have to become the patient. We have to become the expert. And I think, like, as you kind of travel through the story, you start to think, like, you know, who's the righteous person here? You know? And sometimes that, you know, the way that medicine and pharmaceutical companies behave and the way that experts behave, like, starts to kind of break down those boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A little bit Robin of Locksley.
I really like the term outlaw because to me, it's someone who is outside the law. It's not against. It's simply that the laws didn't take into account the reality of someone's situation. And that it's like when you say to people, would you break the law to save your child's life? That's not even a question. We all know, of course we would. Would we break the law to save our lives? Most of us would, not all. And Cluster Busters is in that second group, which is what would you do to not have the worst pain that human beings can experience? Especially when you're told that your ailment either doesn't exist or the medications that we're offered we know don't work, and we don't want to talk to you. And so, fortunately, and Joanna, I got to tell you, the book, you know, you know a lot about professors, and you know a lot about the way they write. We're all trained to write badly. That's the only way you get into journals. So as I'm reading this, I'm underlining two sets of things. One is things that I'm supposed to know, and I kind of knew, but I didn't get it right, that she did. And two is beautiful turns of phrase, beautiful ways of explaining and explicating and holding the truth of these stories. And the book is much bigger than Cluster Busters, because the world in which Cluster Busters occurs is the world of science, is the world of medicine, is the world of pharmacology, is the world of big pharma, and the world of the way government hopes that problems will go away year after year after year, and doesn't take a stand in either direction. So that's the kind of, in a sense, the government is a kind of outside the law itself. And so I've been reviewing the book today, and I'm actually somewhat upset because I'm reminded of so many terrible things so many things that didn't quite work out, that could have moved our helping Cluster Busters, helping the cluster headache people around the world so much sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the what we owe to Bob and to the many people who contribute and who've helped and who teach others. We can never pay that back. That's just, they're a kind of hero that has remained deliberately mostly invisible because they have to. And when I was at the Cluster Busters conference, they showed a film of someone who was a cluster buster and managing. And this was a BBC documentary, if I remember it right. And the filmmaker says, you know, what would you do if you weren't able to grow your mushrooms? And he looks into the camera. He says, I'd kill myself. That's not what you usually get when people talk about a medical condition. So I'm a little. Those of you who know me know that I rarely go. But this book is disturbingly powerful, and the stories are stunningly both accurate and as Joanna was saying, that, you know, her interest in the parts that don't get representation couldn't have been better. She couldn't have been a better person to do this book.
It's my sense as well. Can't wait to
Okay,
meet
I
Flash.
just have to say thank
also.
you so much. I don't think anybody's ever said anything so nice to me. Thank you.
I've just been over the moon about your book. It's so fun, so helpful, so telling in a nice, clean way. Things that I think a lot of us feel in the psychedelic movement in general. You you jumped onto a tweet I did yesterday about this. There was this person who was on 60 Minutes ages ago talking about how they weren't going to go ahead and buy their cancer medication from China because it was illegal. They can't afford it, so they're just going to die in a couple months. And I was just like floored by that level of respect for authority. I can't relate to it. If that's what it even is, I don't really know if that's what it is. But I think there's a strong correlate here in this cluster world. And Bob, I'd love for you to speak to this. When we did that small little event at MAPS Denver last year, you talked about how once a cluster head discovers that a mushroom can interrupt their cycle, they know suicide's off the table. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So if you have cluster headaches, suicidal ideation is usually right alongside you for most of your journey. And I've lost a lot of friends over the years. And, you know, when we did a pain scale evaluation on a survey where we were having people compare their pain levels to other things that they have gone through, because, everybody can rate their pain at a 10, but some of them may not have ever had anything really painful to compare it to. So all of these people compared their cluster headaches to childbirth and kidney stones and everything else. And 29 people actually had um, gunshot wounds. One of them I still have the X-ray of that tried to commit suicide and shot to the head. And they all rated cluster headaches more painful than their gunshot wound. That was actually down the scale of a couple of points. Yeah, suicide is very much a factor with people with cluster headaches for a lot of reasons. They're very isolating, and trying to find help is never easy. Trying to find anybody that you can talk to and that can relate to you is really difficult. So people that walk into a cluster conference with 100 or 200 people finally walk into a room where they don't need to explain themselves to anyone, and it's a life-changing event for them. But yeah, finding something. In the early days of the message board, everybody was comparing notes, and the reason the message board took off was because everybody needed help. Everybody needed something more than they were getting at their local pharmacy or help from their doctor. So they were all exchanging little tips and ideas that they had that kept them alive. And one day, somebody from Scotland shared a tip about possibly LSD helping. So we worked that into people testing with magic mushrooms, and just the word that there might be something out there to help people, even if they haven't tried it yet, gives them hope that something might be out there. And it's the same with all other research for headache disorders and clusters. Is if you're leading a really crummy life and there's no research out there that may improve it down the road, you're always examining the quality of life that you're living in at that point and trying to decide if you can live that same life for the next 40 years. But the discovery of magic mushrooms for people was life-changing and walked a lot of people off of the edge. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, thank you. Joanna, are there any stories you're aware of that are even close to this cluster busters narrative in psychedelia or peripheral fields, maybe?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's it's a little bit like Dallas Buyers Club with mushrooms, right? Like it's a little, the HIV/AIDS had to that patient group really had to fight for care, and they worked really hard to make scientists understand how important their disease was. And people watch that happen. The cluster headache is a much smaller disease, and this is a much longer fight. But we do have examples of citizen science and DIY medicine making changes. And actually, Clusterbusters has done that. And I think people aren't quite aware of how much progress Clusterbusters has made and how much this group has driven innovation in the area of psychedelics and pain. And part of the reason why we don't know that is because first of all, psychedelic science is extremely reliant on the underground to create research. And I think Jim Fadiman can talk about that, right? Because he's been collecting data from the underground, right?
Right.
But because of all of the restrictions on university scientists, it's much, much easier to collect this kind of observational data. But scientists, we have to pretend that we're objective, right? Science has to pretend that it doesn't have this relationship with culture. Now, I think everybody saw that might go wrong earlier today in the FDA hearing. But wait for the NBA. I mean, people might not know what today was, but in the kind of FDA submission for MDMA-assisted therapy, there was a lot of attention drawn to the relationship between the drug sponsor and the drug. And that often happens in drug trials anyway. But the trick of science is to pretend that science happens in the vacuum. In the case of psychedelic research, it couldn't happen without these relationships to the underground. And in the case of cluster headache science, a lot of that connection had been erased, particularly in the early days.
Yeah, we underrate what we call citizen science, and Joanna has given a much better term for psychedelic citizen science, which is participatory, which is citizen science is like when people go out and count the number of birds, or a lot of amateur astronomers, as they're called. There are a lot of sciences where people are allowed to play. But psychedelic science is participatory, which is it's people who have had internal experience that's hard to explain, except to other people who've had the same internal experience. So we've kind of denigrated personal experience. It used to be that's all science was, and then we got groups of people and we could count them, and we said, oh, we can now have statistics. That's better than personal observation, and we started to lose a lot of the personal observation. And then we went from statistics to data. And data, you cut out almost everything but numbers. And so you have really very, very, very little idea of what actually the numbers mean. And I see these science papers, and you can't get something published in most science journals unless there are tables or graphs. And I was told very early on in my career, however, anything you want the reader to actually know about your research that's obviously right in the center of your graph, you have to tell them, because they won't look at the graphs and they won't look at the data, but they can't get published without it. So we're in a funny place where scientists have a kind of inner rigidity and a system where they punish each other for stepping outside the rigidity. And if that sounds like similar to religion, it is. Okay? So when someone says to me, I say something, and they say, well, is that in the Bible? And I kind of know the rest of the conversation. And if someone says to me, is there a double-blind study? I know where we're going. Now, if I say to them, do you know where double-blind studies became popular? I have no idea. But if you read Joanna's book, you'll get it. It was a piece of legislation because drugs used to be a lot tested in a very different way that made also sense. Worst possible kind of research for psychedelics is a double-blind study. So on the other hand, you have people like Bob and the people with clusters who say, I can't wait for science. Here's something that helped my friend. Here's someone that helped someone I've never heard of. I can participate in testing its validity in the most important thing in my life, my own body. And I can then tell other people what I've learned, what didn't work and what worked. And that's how science actually, if you strip away the last step, which is data, most science looks a lot more like cluster busters than you would think. We only see that kind of last step.
Yeah, so I just want to jump onto that. So my field is called Science and Technology Studies. And a lot of the research in science and technology studies is they're ethnographies of laboratories. And to just sort of quickly summarize the findings from that research, it's essentially exactly what you just heard. That scientists clean up all the messiness of their research to produce this very clean looking article that makes it seem like there was no bias. But that's really not what the work of science looks like. And, it's hard. I find it in some ways really challenging to explain that to a public that is increasingly distrustful of science, because I do believe in science. I do believe in the scientific method. But I think it's also important to explain that scientists are also humans who have belief systems, who live in a world where they have all kinds of biases. That does enter into their research. Just the randomized control trial is not like a fix-all solution to this, to the messiness of human life. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
All right. Yeah, real data is messy, especially exploratory data and unpopular data. At one point in the book, an expert at Harvard is asked, what will it take to make this a drug on the market? And he says, well, between 40 and $100 million. On the other hand, how much does it cost to grow mushrooms in your closet? $100. But out of that $100, you have like months and months of self-help. It's a very different model, and we need more books. We need more of this kind of exposing that it's really hard to go through a system that is not designed to help, but is unfortunately designed predominantly for profit. There's nothing wrong with profit, but it shouldn't be the beginning of what the search is about. And we're now seeing in psychedelics what I call the greed vultures have flown in. People with no understanding except that, gee, if a lot of people could use this substance, we could charge a lot of money. And you say, well, what do you know about the substance? Well, I don't have to know anything about the substance. Wait a moment. Okay.
Bob, could you maybe share a little bit about like the early tension that you experienced around psychedelics being introduced, and I guess perhaps how it felt when you realized people could grow their own?
Yeah. Well, there was tension from the very beginning on our message board. A guy named Flash brought the idea to the board, and half of the board wanted to kick him off because they thought that he was just there trying to sell drugs. And the other half, for the most part, thought, had they done any psychedelics earlier in their life, their first thought was having a cluster attack on LSD would be the last thing I would ever want to do. I don't know if I could survive something like that. So it took some convincing of people that were willing to look at it to really start getting some information on it. And what's interesting is the part that there is a large portion of our society that won't take anything unless it's legal and prescribed by their doctor and hasn't gone through a phase 3 trial. If they can't get it at Walgreens for something serious, they don't want to do it. Making it illegal is, adds a whole nother subset of people that won't do it. We had one sufferer who had suffered for decades, and when this idea was brought to him, I mean, this was a guy that a lot of people knew, and we've watched him suffer, and he refused to try them because one of his children had become addicted to some drugs earlier in their life, and he promised them that he would stop any drug use and never use illegal drugs again if his child would. And he made that promise to them, and he refused to break that promise. And all of us tried to make him understand that his daughter would certainly understand if he used these. And he thought that she probably would anyways, but he didn't want to break a promise. So he never did try them, as far as I know. So once we found out that mushrooms were helping people, we had a couple things going on. Number one, we didn't have a very wide reach. How do I reach 350,000 people in the United States? And we were reaching them one at a time on a message board. So we didn't have a really wide reach. And the other thing was that people wouldn't use them unless they were able to get it at CVS or Walgreens. And so what we decided to do was try to get the information out to help as many people as were willing to be helped and that we could reach, and then start the process of trying to bring something to the market that people were able to go to Walgreens and pick up. We knew it was going to take a while to do that, but we weren't about to wait that time and stop offering this information to everybody else that wanted to use it. But I don't think any of us knew how difficult this was going to be. So, and here I am 25 years later, and who knows, I might be still 20 years away from it being on the market.
Right. I feel like Colorado has perhaps made the most progress domestically here in terms of access, though it's certainly not a perfect situation, and we're still not even explicitly legal. I've been saying a fun catchphrase for years, Bob. I'm not done until I'm buying LSD at Walmart without a prescription. I don't actually know how that's going to work out, but I've been trying to insist on how hard I believe that we need safe supply for everybody here on all of these different topics, especially life-threatening conditions with.
Yeah.
Well, there's a kind of larger picture, which is we forget in the United States, where we have been talked into that the FDA loves you and takes care of you and protects you, and it does as best it can. But we forget that 80% of the people in the world use herbal medicine. Now, I'm going to say that again, because that's 80% of the world uses not predominantly herbal medicine, but uses herbal medicine. And as we have all recognized, no matter what the laws are, mushrooms don't understand that they're illegal. They grow on every continent. There's 200 species, 200 varieties, and that's without mentioning the ones we're creating, all of which have psilocybin. So they're available. They're part of the ecology that people have. And in every location where mushrooms have been found and indigenous people are there, they've learned to use them. High doses for ritual, low doses for health. So we have to understand that the current situation is historically very, very rare, and that the United States methodology is equally unusual. And we just have to put that in a larger context. So as we said earlier, and as Joanna did, we are outside the laws because the laws were not designed for us. Nothing, no evil intention, but they simply didn't fit the situation.
Thanks. Joanna, I'm curious if you could speak to this idea of you did a little bit in the book. How criminal is somebody? This is a super abstract question, right? How criminal is somebody if they're working to gain access to things that the powers that be don't want them to have in order to save their lives? And that's abstract, but what did you find in your process of writing the book?
Well, I found it was very, very difficult to find the statistics. But there are people who, first of all, have gotten in trouble and continue to face all kinds of legal actions for using mushrooms for health. The other, I think, really troubling problem is the fear people have about using psychedelics. So, and I know that Bob can speak to this. I even at at clusterbusters conferences all the time, I would always meet people who, because of their jobs or because of some life circumstance, were much, much, much too fearful to try psychedelics. It just the stakes were too high. I want to just kind of make sure, though, that people understand that for cluster headache treatment, this isn't a microdose, but it's certainly not a macrodose that people are using. It's, Bob can explain it a little bit more, but we're talking about like between 1 to 2 grams tops of dried mushrooms. So just like, you're going to feel the effects, but you're not going to see God. And to kind of piggyback on this, Jim's comments about safety. One of the things I really appreciated about clusterbusters is that they took a lot of time to make sure that people were using mushrooms in the safest possible way. But even still, there was so much fear. No, even people who were suicidal and just suffering from so much pain were frightened about the consequences of taking, of eating a mushroom. And, I think that's really what has driven Bob to, keep moving forward with medicalization. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the sort of sense that I've always gotten from you.
Yep, that was always the drive. There was trying to get everybody feeling comfortable using it. It was really easy for some people to start growing their own, and for $100 have a year's supply, and their safest supply because they were supplying it themselves. They weren't having to go out and buy it from someone else and not know exactly what it was they might be buying. But there was just so many people that didn't want to try it or were afraid of trying it, either because of everything that they heard of 40 years of a frying egg being this is your brain on drugs, to being afraid of being drug tested at work. There's a lot of that going on, and it really scares a lot of people. And finding a job with cluster headaches that you can keep is not always easy. And some people, it takes maybe 10 years to finally settle into a job that understands that they might have a couple of rough weeks every year and might need to bring an oxygen tank into their office, or completely stay away because it isn't legal. There are just so many different reasons people weren't willing to try it, and which is kind of fascinating because those that have tried it ask, how can you not take the chance on trying this? You're suicidal. You're just suffering so much pain, and this pressure from society, I guess, in so many different ways stops people from changing and saving their lives, which is very frustrating for all of us in this area. And so, we decided that we needed to get out there and bring some awareness to this and try to move it forward so that this was available to everyone. And yeah, if they could, if it was over the counter at Walmart, I think everybody would have a problem, or would not have a problem in going and trying it. And with a little bit of instruction on what you may feel on 1 gram of dried mushrooms, and you're going to spend an hour laughing and an hour crying, and maybe the next 2 months without any cluster headache attacks. It's usually worth giving it a try.
That seems like a risk profile I can live with.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's astounding. And yeah, thanks for your confirmation there. Jim, I'm kind of curious. It seems like you had a good thought there that you might want to jump in with. But if not, it's all right. So this idea, well, Joanna, you had a really great idea that you posted the other day as well about sort of the, I guess, medical sociology, like the history of medicine and how hard the current establishment had to fight to get into power and be respected in the way they are today. And I wonder if there's anything that's worth tying into this conversation from that kind of historical perspective.
Yeah, so I think that so if you reading, I think that the history of the medical profession is both fascinating and incredibly relevant to understanding how just the problem that psychedelic medicine has. It was only around in 1910. If you know anything about the history of medicine, it was 1910. The American Medical Association had commissioned something called the Flexner Report to look at medical education. Physicians really had no power. They didn't really have any tools to help people with. They didn't have much in the way of medicine. And the Flexner Report looked at what medical education looked like. And it's named after Abraham Flexner. And Abraham Flexner was like, hey, you guys don't really have any medical education to speak of. He thought Johns Hopkins was okay, and maybe like 2 other university hospitals, but everything else was kind of a sham. And it was only around like maybe in the 1940s that the pharmaceutical industry starts. So they pulled, AMA is like, oh, no, we need to start actually training our doctors. It's only in the 1940s that doctors have anything to give their patients, right? Because the drug companies start making antibiotics, and then you have, all of these psychopharmaceuticals coming out. LSD isn't the only psychopharmaceutical, right? There's a whole bunch of more kind of interesting drugs. And that's all fueling the power of doctors, and people loved it, right? Like housewives didn't just look happy for no reason. They were on all kinds of, they were on Middletown, they were sedated. I mean, you can't just do the dishes looking so smiley with a lot of sedatives. And, everybody tells that story about how, Sandoz was just giving out LSD for free. That's just like how medical marketing and experimentation happened. And doctors liked it. Like they liked having that kind of control. So it's only in the early 1960s, after a couple of drug scandals, including thalidomide, a couple of really high profile drug overdoses, Marilyn Monroe, right? That Congress passes some legislation, which just brings us the randomized control trials. The AMA hated that. They didn't want that at all. They were like, hey, do you know who can tell if a drug works? Doctors. We don't want no RCTs. That seems like a pain in the butt. They saw that as a threat to their power. And the FDA was like, hey, like we can't just like rely on doctors' opinions. We need math to tell us what works and what doesn't work. And that's what RCTs are. They're an experiment. It's math. Timothy Leary didn't help, He wasn't really an MD, but he wasn't helpful. And doctors wanted, now that we're bringing psychedelics back into universities, doctors want to look really sober. They want to look buttoned up. They don't want their reputation smeared by the underground. They want to make sure that they still look really super professional. And, doctors their kind of reputations are still, they always feel like their reputations are precarious. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you talk to a doctor in a certain specialty and they express all kinds of status anxiety. I have that all the time because I talk to a lot of headache doctors and they're always like, nobody likes us. We don't have any, a reputation. So, Bob, you know this.
Yes. Yeah.
They're all, and you're like, what do you mean you're a neurologist? Like you make so much money. I'm always like, what do you mean nobody thinks that you're special?
Right. Right.
But doctors always are a little bit worried about how the reputation might be smeared. And I think it comes from this like anxiety that they're going to lose their position. So they take they really do a lot of what we would call in sociology front stage work, trying to make sure they wear their white coats, their stethoscopes around their neck. They try and make sure everybody knows they're really serious and they're sober and they're not doing those drugs. They're just testing them.
Yeah.
The history of drugs is a whole wonderful history. Psychonauts, Mike J., again, a fine writer, but one that comes, the cycle where a drug is discovered, excited, everyone's using it, it's in the pharmacy, it has side effects, it starts to kill people, it's addictive, the law's against it, and we have another one. One of my favorite moments is Freud, who happened to be the Tim Leary of cocaine. At one point gives a testimonial that the cocaine made by such and such pharmaceutical company who was trying to break into this very lucrative market is just as good as the cocaine made by a different pharmaceutical company. And you shouldn't worry. Okay, there's a little piece of the history which shifts the way things are, which is the cycle repeats itself, and it has not repeated itself with psychedelics. It's had taken a different route, where psychedelics were never medicalized. They were, before they got going, they were demonized. And Sandoz literally would send you, if you had stationery, which you could create, it would send you, say, I'd like to work with LSD and give it to such and such. And they would send you LSD, and they would say, literally, the restrictions are that you need to let us know what you do with this, because they were desperately trying to find a profitable way of dealing with the most powerful pharmaceutical they'd ever come across, and they kept not making it profitable, and eventually they pulled back. And the underground, which realized that if you could make 1 gram of LSD, you could give it to 10,000 people, shifted the way drugs were used in the United States. And the people who are afraid, what I've found is if you say to them, do you know how many people have taken LSD, just LSD, not psilocybin, not everything else, since it became illegal? And they say, 800,000, 2 million, 40 million. So 40 million people have taken LSD. The number of deaths attributed strictly to LSD, 0. It's hard to find a substance. I mean, water actually has a higher death rate than psychedelics. And what Bob is saying is totally true, that people will say, well, if the government made it illegal, they've made some bad things illegal that were bad. This must be one, because the government isn't trying to kill us. It is trying to limit our capacity to heal ourselves.
Point well made. In Colorado, we do all these analogies, or one of my friends is making all these analogies around if we're allowed to go skiing in some of these places where we could easily die or break our legs in very robust ways. Like, psilocybin's illegal? What? Like, how does this stuff make sense? And how do we make policy and laws make sense? And anyway, we're coming close to the end here. So I want to make sure people know that we're talking about Psychedelic Outlaws, which is a new book. When was the actual release day? Was it yesterday?
Today.
Wow.
Thank
Today.
you.
Yeah. That's outstanding. How long have you been working on this one?
A very long time. 10 years. 10 years. I had some babies. And there was a pandemic. I had to take care of the babies during a pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a big
absolutely.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
and again, it's bigger than that. It's a wonderful look at some of the history in a way that none of us really understood. So I want to pitch the book. Okay.
Thank you. I wanted, thank you for saying that. I really wanted this story to really be able to tell a new history of psychedelics. So I'll let you tell this. I'll let you pitch it.
Well, that's exactly. I'm delighted because that's what I got out of it. Because when you're reading a history and you kind of know stuff, and then you find out there was a little side to it that changed your opinion, you are so grateful to the author for letting you understand what actually happened. And as we've been talking about medicine and the ups and downs, the history of how Bob and Harvard and a couple of psychiatrists interacted over the years, and how the system kept interfering, and then the personalities would. It's very moving. It's very sad, and it's very true. And it is one of those. It's an untold story that has enormous implications. And so right now, people with cluster headaches can get good, solid, well-researched over many years information from cluster busters. I just finished a book about microdosing, and there's a very small section on clusters. At the end of it says, put this book down, be serious. If you have a cluster headache, you have to go to cluster busters because you need to know all that you need to know. And so that's where we are. We are dependent on cluster busters and similar groups around the world for a number of conditions. And yes, medicine will catch up, but research comes last, not first, when you're dealing with natural substances.
Well said.
Yeah.
Bob, would you like to add anything here?
Thanks, Jim. No, I just came off a very emotional week, and this whole topic is very emotional for me. So I appreciate you having me here. So thanks.
Thank you for making it. Joanna, anything you want to close with here for us?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. And there's just one last thing, which is that I thought I was going to be writing a book about political suppression and the vital importance of psychedelics. And actually, I ended up writing a book about care. And that's what Bob Wold has, and the network that he has helped create has done, is they have pulled together care. They care for people. Then that is something that we don't do in medicine. And that's the surprise. That's the shocker. That the mushrooms knit together a community, and we really just need to, that's what we need to fix. We need to come together and help each other. And thank you, Bob. This has been I have had a front row seat of all the work that you've been doing, and you really need to go to sleep now. So
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I
All right,
appreciate everybody. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all for watching this. Check out Psychedelic Outlaws. I'm riveted. I'm about 3/4 of the way through. Can't wait to wrap it up, and really can't wait to do more to help promote this book. It's extraordinary. So thank you for all your 10 years of work on it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks
All
for
right,
having
everybody.
me.
Yep.
Take care, and we'll see
Thanks,
you on the
Bob,
next
for
time.
inviting me years ago
Yep.
to the Buster Conference.
You were honestly one of the most appreciated speakers we've ever had in 20 years of conferences. So thank you.
Well,
You were a star. So thank you very
because I
much.
don't take everything quite as seriously.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. That's nice to know.
Yeah.
All right. Take care,
Okay.
everybody.
All right. Yep.
Bye.
Thanks.